Ray Nowosielski and John Duffy. Welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you, Demetri.
Hello.
John is also more of an introvert than Ray. Is that right? Not only are you more introverted, seemingly, okay, Ray's shaking his head, but also basically more than half of John's face is occluded between his hoodie and
I was
the
going to
sort
ask
of.
him if he was doing that on purpose.
I didn't know if we were coming in for video, so I had no idea.
It's all good. So people that are looking at the video, we don't necessarily always release the full videos, but we do try to clip them now because I told you guys my team has been on my ass about not doing a good job taking advantage of YouTube. So this is your book, The Watchdogs Didn't Bark, the CIA, NSA, and the Crimes of the War on Terror. This was published in 2017?
2018.
2018. But you guys were working on this book for a long, long time, weren't you?
If you want to get really technical, it was an investigation that ran about 15 years. Yeah. But we worked on the book was greenlit in 2016, so it was about 2 years on that last leg.
So was what got you to write the book the on redaction of the 28 pages from the congressional report from the joint inquiry?
I think it was totally random, honestly. We every time we would do a new 9/11 or War on Terror based project over the years, we would say that's it, we're done. We're not going to be these guys who always stick to this one subject and won't let it go. At some point, we just got to say that's what we did, and we're done. And then we would find out something new that would just make it necessary that who else is going to tell this? We know this. I think we can get some answers on this, and so that just kept happening. But I think we really were kind of done, except that we'd never wrapped it all up in a bow and put everything we knew together in one place. And then a guy named Manuel Stokes happened to know that David Talbot was recruiting writers that he liked, new young writers, into his Hot Books series for Skyhorse Publishing, and he had an in, and he suggested he and I submit a book proposal based on John Duffy's and my 15 years of work, or at that point 13, I guess. And we did, and I was highly skeptical but it was an immediate yes, and we were a go. And Emmanuel had to drop out fairly early due to personal reasons, and so I just immediately turned to Duffy and said, you want to write this book with me? And that was that.
So Skyhorse Publishing, I've noticed this because whenever I have Skyhorse authors on, I always feel like these are the kind of authors that a lot of other publishers would be afraid to publish, or the stuff is kind of really edgy. What is Skyhorse's brand? What are they? What kind of stuff do they tend to publish? What kind of authors do they tend to publish, and topics?
It's a great question. So Tony Lyons is the publisher, and yeah, I think they try to be in that area that I think The Intercept tries to operate in a little bit. So it's we're left, but we can be right, and basically we're just going to let the truth guide us, and refuse to let whatever the current political norms are stop us from telling truths. So I think that's kind of their guiding principle. Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of it. It was a guy I was on a panel with who is one of their guys that they published that's really excellent, but I'm actually blanking right now.
So they did Kiriakou stuff too, right? They did his.
Yeah, that's right. They did John Kiriakou, former CIA, who was included in our book, who had revealed the torture program. Yeah.
He did his book about Abu Zubaydah, I think, with them.
And he's the only person that went to jail in this whole story, right? And he's someone who went to jail for blowing the whistle on the torture programs. If I'm not mistaken.
He didn't technically go to jail for that. He feels like that was the reason they were out to get him. He went to jail technically. I don't know what the name of the charge was, but it was because he had handed a business card with someone's name on it to a journalist, and that person had formerly been in the clandestine services. But it was years after he had gone on ABC News and talked about the CIA's torture program, in which that was the first confirmation of what was sort of an open secret. I mean, people knew the CIA was doing it. There were whispers, but he was the one who went on and said, yeah, we're doing this.
Yeah.
But when he said it, he was like, but it's a good thing.
He was an analyst at the CIA who later trained in spy operations, and he led the capture of Abu Zubaydah in Pakistan in 2002. There are other characters like this who are sort of on the sort of white hats or whatever term you want to use, guys like Mark Rossini at the FBI. It- uh, a lot of this stuff was stuff that I found also in certain other documents that I read, but nowhere have I seen all this stuff pieced together as well as in your book. So I want to, before we begin this conversation formally, to just really highly recommend this book. I think anyone who's interested in getting a more complete picture of what happened in the years leading up to 9/11 and subsequently, this is the best thing I have read. And reading this book will also help you find other compendiary documents and videos, including an interview you guys did, a famous interview you did with Richard Clarke, who was officially what? The liaison between counterterrorism within the White House and people at CIA? Like, what was his official role in on 9/11 and in the months leading up to 9/11?
Yeah, I think they colloquially they called him the counterterror czar. But he had been upped to cabinet level under Clinton and was one of the very few, along with George Tenet, the CIA director, who got carried over by George W. Bush, so from a Democrat to a Republican. And although Bush, with his new national security advisor Condoleezza Rice, they sort of demoted Clarke down to sub cabinet again.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of famously weren't really listening to him as he was sounding the alarm, whereas he always claimed the Clintons were, obviously, since they'd made him cabinet level, were very attentive to what he was trying to bring them.
Yeah. So we'll have a chance to get into all this, guys. Before we do, what are your backgrounds? Like, how did you guys get into filmmaking? Was this what you guys went to school for? Where did you grow up? Like, what can you tell us about both of you? And how and when did your paths cross? When did you guys get to meet each other?
Ray and I met each other in film school in like the year 2000, and we were attending film school at Columbia College in Chicago. We met in an introductory film production class. It was an election year, so it was hot topic, talking about Bush v. Gore. And I think just through random chit chat and chatter, he and I kind of linked up, kind of like-minded people. And yeah, we just started hanging out. We would work on each other's film projects together, and we just became friends, hung out in college, and then graduated in 2003. Obviously, 9/11 had happened, 2001, and then we had kept in touch post-graduation and just talked about the things that were being slowly revealed about the 9/11 attacks that were weird or off or that didn't seem to match the official narrative. And it was something that we found very interesting. We'd been big fans of the film JFK, and we'd watched it probably a couple times drinking beers back in college. And we're like, wow, it would be really cool if someone could make a movie like that about 9/11 that was focusing on all the characters you don't really know about and showing some of the alternative narratives or alternative possibilities. And we were like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we made that movie? And documentary format was much more possible than some grand narrative film, full of stars. And
Especially straight out of film school. That was
yes,
03. We were just graduated.
yeah. So we had when we decided to start up what became the film Press for Truth, that was 2004. And yeah, we're two guys who have like basically shit jobs, no money, and it was sort of like a by hook or crook thing to get that across the finish line with the aid of many other people who came in after the fact. But that was the genesis, and it was just us kind of. And I will say, wholeheartedly, fully admitting, we were not smart guys. We were not good at parsing truth from bullshit. I think Ray was a little better at it than I was.
No.
Maybe that was a good place to start because it made us open to ideas and concepts that led us. But I think we became quickly aware that that scene, the people who were interested in 9/11, was full of kooks. It was full of people who would believe anything you told them as long as it wasn't the official story.
No, I was just Duff. I've heard you mention 04 a couple times on prior interviews here recently, and I think we got our start. If you'll remember, we actually got our startup funds in 03. a little bit from my parents. We had pitched them like, nah, it's going to be huge, a very profitable documentary. And they're like, sure, okay, we'll
I
help you
remember the
out.
road trip though. This is so in the weeds for people who don't care, but I remember our road trip and I remember us talking about it. Was that, I thought it was the
But it
04.
was, well, this is by way of setup. Do you recall that the first thing we did before our road trip to New York and DC and all that was the Toronto like
I rem
wackadoo conference? Okay,
Yeah, no, I remember
that's
that,
the road trip.
but no, the road trip I was talking about was when we went to LA and
Oh,
we were kicking this idea around. But
got
anyway,
it.
this is boring
Well,
for me.
but it is in the weeds, but I was bringing it up because that was where we started. We essentially like went out to where all the people had the wackiest theories, and we met and we convinced most of them to come back to our hotel and where we had a setup, and we interviewed each one for hours. And so we got to know these people, and we kind of immediately said, okay, this is not what we want to do, and these are not the people we want to be perceived
But
as.
it's
So
where we
what
met
do
Paul
we need to do?
Thompson.
But it is where we met Paul Thompson.
It's where we met Paul Thompson, who made the Terror Timeline on History Commons, and who he himself was not a super wacky guy. He was like a data sponge, and he was more of someone who just really wanted to make a grand chronology of all the media reports regarding 9/11. And he was very good at remembering facts. So I think that was the best thing that came from that trip is
Yeah.
that we met Paul, who ends up in the film as sort of someone who strings it together for us, kind of a central character. And
Yeah, and
he
Paul,
kind of clued us into the idea of like, oh, there's good information and then there's crap.
yeah, because Paul went to Stanford. Paul was featured in the Esquire Genius issue, and he worked with this guy named Derek Mitchell, who created something called History Commons. And the idea was simply to pull the individual facts from all the news stories on a given topic and put them in chronological order and link back to them so that essentially I think the idea was that you might find a really interesting fact that doesn't really fit the overall narrative the public's being given on a subject, but it's sort of buried within a story that otherwise appears to be very on board the narrative. And if you start compiling just the facts and their sources, you start to find a very different narrative than maybe the ones being pushed by the owners of these media properties.
I love this. So just I want to highlight a few things that come up for me while I'm listening to you guys talk, and hopefully we'll have a chance to explore them in more detail. One is I love that you guys independently developed your investigative skill set. And you became clearly better at discerning truth from fiction, figuring out where to spend more of your time, what might be a useful source, etc. And this also speaks directly to your evolution in the course of this process, from potentially sort of just like wild-eyed conspiracy theorists to people that actually could develop theories that might involve conspiracies, but that are based in fact and actually sort of not about your own emotional reactions, but actually just trying to understand what's true and what's not true. And I think that's super important because that's where most people, I feel like, get lost, at least the ones who are able to get a lot of attention for their theories because they sensationalize. And that has been I think that's been the single biggest, besides the official cover-ups, that's probably been the single biggest bottleneck to actually getting to what the truth has been, which is that the vast majority of attention is devoted to the wrong ideas or the wrong explanation for what's happened. Um, so you said you did Press for Truth, which was the first documentary. What was the project in which the interview with Richard Clarke was part of?
Yeah. So we were trying to make a sequel of sorts to Press for Truth. And Clarke had written his books, and some other people had started diving into what was going on at Alec Station, what was going on at the FBI, and people had really latched on to this footnote in the 9/11 Commission report. I want to say it's in the end notes to chapter 6, and it was footnote 44. And that was something that sort of spilled the beans about there being knowledge at CIA's Alec Station about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi coming into the country, having visas, and desk officers there who were working for the FBI trying to pass the information and being held back uh, by the CIA side of that station. So that was all contained in this little footnote, and it's almost the whole story. So people in the space had been getting sort of excited about that. It kind of got us excited about it. And we thought, wow, if there is a follow-up to Press for Truth, this is it. It's about this topic. And we started figuring out how we could make a second film. And the 2008 market crash happened. Potential investors had to back out because their own personal finances were in disarray. And somehow, just like with the first film, we started just cobbling together a little bit of cash, hiring some people who could shoot for us. We took a trip to DC. We arranged some interviews. And one of them was Richard Clarke, who had then moved into the private sector. And that was 2009. And it was all intended to be part of a follow-up documentary film that unfortunately we were not able to complete just because we didn't have a budget for it. And the initial things we shot, we kind of kept close to our chest. And then finally in 2011, we released that interview of Clarke. It was the 10-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And Ray had this idea, okay, we can't necessarily finish this as a film, but everything we've shot, we can strip the audio from and use the audio, and we can fill it out maybe with some phone calls and things like that we can record. And he cut it together into a podcast, which in 2011 was not a known thing. Podcasts
You
were
couldn't
very
even get your
small.
podcast on Apple Podcasts without authorization from Apple at
Yeah,
that
it
time.
was.
Right.
I didn't know what a podcast was when Ray suggested it, but I just kind of went along with him. I'm like, sure, man. If like you think it's a good idea, go nuts. And
I like to claim that we were one of the first true crime podcasts because we came out 2 years before Serial. Although we were like we weren't serialized, we were intended to be a multi-part, and then we kind of just did the one and got waylaid into some other stuff, and then the sequel sort of became the book. That was because for years after there were people who would listen. It was I get the feeling it was like one of those things where somebody has like a like a VHS tape with something really cool that hasn't, before the internet, and they're like sending it around or telling you like, you got to watch this thing. And I feel like people in the know would pass each other, who is Rich Blee, and they would notice that it said that like part 2 was coming, and then part 2 never came. So I think for a very long time we just get random questions where someone would track us down and go, "Where's this part 2?"
So I want to clarify some things here, and I'm going to do this my best to do this while we have this conversation, because the vast majority of people won't even know what you're talking about here.
Sure.
So Rich Blee was the head of Alec Station during the 9/11 attacks. He wasn't the creator of Alec Station. The creator of Alec Station was Michael Scheuer, who wrote Imperial Hubris and did a whole book tour back in the early parts of the post 9/11 period, I think after the Iraq invasion. We could talk about him a little bit. I've also met him, and I told you guys I used to have a show on RT America. We're all the same age. We grew up in the same environment, probably took in a lot of the same information. And reading your book also, besides the fact that it was really sad in multiple instances, and I've talked about this with Senator Bob Kerrey, who I interviewed yesterday on this topic. I mentioned to him how sick I felt at least twice while reading this book. But so Rich Blee was the head of Alec Station. Alec Station actually was named after Michael Scheuer's kid, his son. And this was the Bin Laden unit. You also mentioned Richard Clarke's book, John. That book was Against All Enemies. And Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mindar were both two of the 9/11 hijackers. These are the ones that landed in Los Angeles after leaving Bangkok, which they got to from the meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where the Cole bombing was planned alongside 9/11. They arrived in Los Angeles. They were shepherded there by al-Bayoumi, who is connected to Saudi intelligence somehow, also getting checks directly from Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, who was U.S. ambassador to the United States at the time. I mean, these are so many pieces to this story. So I just wanted to highlight those really quick before we continued. But you were talking, John, and I want you to go ahead and continue where you were. Do you remember where you were?
Actually, Ray, I think Ray was just ending out on how, like, you were asking initially about the Richard Clarke interview, and we did that as part of a follow-up film. And
Who is Rich Blee?
Yeah, that ultimately became a podcast, Who is Rich Blee? That we tried to spill as many of the beans in that as we could for the 10-year 9/11 anniversary. And then finally, we wrote this book in 2018 as the end-all be-all compendium of all this information.
Yeah.
But if you'll indulge me for a second, I wouldn't mind kind of just scene setting the whole thing for like audiences that are younger than us and did miss all this. It's like
I would love for you to do that. Yeah.
9/11 happens. It's traumatizing to everyone, surely most to the people who lost loved ones, or obviously the people who were near the buildings, but all of us were exposed to it endlessly on TV. And we recognized that a political shift had happened, that this president who had barely made it in by a Supreme Court ruling was suddenly very much empowered. 90% approval ratings, I think the highest in history. So if you were skeptical at all, you were in the shut the hell up minority.
Yeah, if you don't love it, leave it. That was
Yeah.
one of the things. People were wearing lapel pin flags all over the news stations. I mean, it was not a good time to be a dissenter.
No, it was not. And we weren't initially. I think we thought, okay, this might be our generation's sort of Pearl Harbor moment, and we were initially supportive of Afghanistan. I think for a lot of people, the shift was that march to Iraq, where even some of the hawks inside CIA were kind of like, oh no, why does he want to do that? That
Michael
sounds like
Scheuer, a
that could
perfect example.
exactly. So that was when we started to, a lot of people's eyes started to open, and ours did, and Paul Thompson's did, and we discovered that timeline. But when we talk about, like odd stuff outside the narrative, I mean, there were a few categories, but it was like Paul Thompson had timelined out the morning of, for all of the key participants in the White House, George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, and all this stuff, and so like you started to see that there were moments when they seemingly could have sent up fighters or could have responded better. And you got to remember afterwards, they're the tough guys who were going after the bad guys and, get out of our way. They were G.I. Joe. So it's like, if you could see that, like, they really didn't respond very well on that morning, then like they were completely misselling themselves to the public. So if you weren't with them politically, that was annoying. And there was a lot of stuff like that. There was stuff that went darker and deeper, and it was hard to know what was up and what was down. So we were just trying to hash through kind of the overall story of what the government was saying, which was no one could have possibly known. There were no warnings. This came out of the blue, versus a lot of stuff that was emerging that seemed to point towards a need for accountability, greater transparency. And in fact, we were inspired by a group of about a dozen 9/11 families who led a larger contingent who fought to get the 9/11 Commission created so they could hash through those questions. And then they told us in the Film Press for Truth that about 70% of their questions and concerns were not answered or addressed by the final report. And that's where we kind of came in with our movie.
So let's what I want to do, and it's been a long time since you guys wrote this book and spent time on this story, but I would like, to the extent that it's possible, to give people an overall sense of what this story is and how far back one would need to begin. And so I can also give you guys some guidelines here when I'm talking about this. I also mean very specifically, yes, of course, the story of 9/11, but that story specifically breaking down into two sub-stories. One is the Saudi connection, the role of the Saudis, who in the Saudi government, what agencies, how on earth this makes sense, because I think this is also important, and I want to highlight it. When videos like the video of al-Bayoumi, which recently came out, I think in May, it was released to the public, of Bayoumi in a video. Again, this is the guy who was probably somehow related to Saudi intelligence, the General Intelligence Presidency, which is their CIA. He was also getting checks from Prince Bandar and his wife from her account in Riggs Banks. This guy is in a video where he's kind of casing the Capitol. He's speaking to somebody. It's presumed that he's a hijacker because this video was found alongside another video of him with the hijackers at their apartment, which he co-signed the lease on. Days after 9/11, these videos were found in a raid of his London apartment alongside a sketch of an airplane with distances from the ground, etc. So, like, this is important context, but none of that's really provided. It's just kind of leaked out. It's in a 60 Minutes video. And this is how the information has come out over the years. And so the public has really no framework for understanding what it means or the ability to put it into context. So I want to put that into context the best that we can. That's one sub-story, the role of the Saudis. And again, this is super important. Why also? Because after 9/11, even though the initial storyline was that, and the ultimate storyline really, I think that most people believe, was that it was largely Al-Qaeda acting alone, we were also told that there was possibly state support, not just the Taliban in Afghanistan, but Iraq. That was a direct storyline that attempted to be concocted, and so we ended up going to war with Iraq in part because of this muddled connection with Al-Qaeda, when in fact the evidence was pointing to Saudi Arabia. And this is something that the Senate and Peter Goss in Congress and in the Intelligence Committee in Congress and Bob Grant knew, and yet we went to war with Iraq. Their joint inquiry, their joint congressional inquiry concluded, I think, in December 2002. So this was known. So this is important. One. Two, the other sub-story is the intelligence community. FBI, CIA, even NSA, which had I think the best intelligence coming out of al-Qaeda's house, who was the father-in-law of al-Mindar. This is the house in Sana'a, Yemen. And so like there's those two parallel stories which are relevant to sort of explain how 9/11 happened when it didn't actually need to happen. Again, this is based on a lot of concrete facts and also some conjecture by people that are really in the most credible position to make those types of conjectures, like Richard Clarke. So that's what I mean, and I would love for you guys to your best. Again, we can kind of do this together because it's been a long time since you worked on this. But let's talk about what that story is. Where would you begin? Who wants to take it first? John, go ahead.
I'm going to try to do this in a way that people who know nothing about this can understand, and to try to make it simple. So around the year 2000, there was word coming in that there was going to be spectacular attacks. The Millenium Threat is what it was called. And you have President Bill Clinton, and he has his CIA, his national security cabinet, all that. And they get scared that something's going to happen. So they start, especially because they round up this guy who's coming in through Canada, and he's got a trunk full of explosives. And in order to prevent any big attacks on the Millennium, there's a hard push to get inside what's going on with Al-Qaeda and other terror groups. And they find out there's this meeting happening in Malaysia. It's at the end of 1999. And the CIA, along with several other international intelligence agencies, monitors this meeting. So just imagine a bunch of terrorist bad guys meeting up in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the CIA, with the help of locals and other intelligence agencies, kind of follows all the guys from across the world who are meeting there and does their best to monitor them while they're there. And they find out that one of those guys, Khalid al-Midar, has a multiple entry visa to the United States in his passport. And this should be a really big piece of information. And after this meeting ends, Khalid al-Midar and Nawaf al-Hazmi travel by way of Bangkok to Los Angeles in the United States. So the first part of the story is that, okay, clearly there's a lot of energy going into watching these guys as they meet in Malaysia to kind of find out what they're up to. So you would think if they were that important, if you see that a couple of them are going right to the United States, that would be a hot tamale. Everyone would be maintaining their focus on it. But according to the official story, they kind of lose these guys, and then, they don't even realize they come to the United States. And all of this is disproved by later cable traffic that you can see at the CIA. The point is they land in Los Angeles, and a Saudi guy helps them move down to San Diego, like pays their rent, gets them in an apartment, and they claim this meeting is random. Oh, I just heard some other guy speaking Arabic at a restaurant, and I struck up a conversation with them, and I helped them move to San Diego and got their lives going. Well, it turns out that guy is very well connected to Saudi intelligence. So that's the beginning of the story. Where it goes is that Khalid al-Midar, this guy who will end up being one of the hijackers on 9/11, who is being shuttled to San Diego by seeming Saudi intelligence, his father-in-law is a guy named al-Hada, who's one of bin Laden's best buddies, and he has a house in Yemen, and that house is a communications hub for the Al-Qaeda network. So
it's like it's like a switchboard.
Yes, Al-Qaeda has been pushed into Afghanistan at this point, and there's not easy communication in and out. And they also know that probably a lot of their communications are going to be monitored. But so they use it as a place to call in, drop messages, pick up messages, whatever. The CIA knows about this place, the NSA knows about this place, and they are listening to the communications that go in and out of this house.
And because it had been involved in the 1998 embassy bombings, and then it would be involved in the U.S.S. Cole,
one of the
small boat that exploded next to it.
One of the intended bombers of the embassy actually chickened out, and he made a phone call to that number, and that's how they figured it out.
Yeah. So it's like tied immediately to a major terrorist attack, and then as they listen in, they come to realize this is a good way to realize everyone who's planning terrorist attacks within the Al-Qaeda sphere.
Yeah, and then
And we should also mention, maybe also just add this additional detail. Like I said, NSA was monitoring this house early on, and then CIA actually set up their own satellite to monitor as well. It was Michael Scheuer's team at that time at Alec Station that spearheaded this. So you had these two different agencies with their own independent capacity to source information from there. It was only the FBI that didn't have access to it, and that later becomes relevant when we get to why the FBI wasn't informed and able to actually begin a criminal investigation into these hijackers when they entered the United States.
Yeah, the FBI New York agents who got the number and identified the hub in the first place and then shared it were the only ones being kept out of the
Well,
loop.
they share, but I mean, technically they did that, but by that time the CIA had already known about it.
True.
But the point is that, like, these guys who are in LA, or rather San Diego at that time, are calling back to that house so that the NSA can see that there's not calls even just coming from that house to other places, but from within the United States, someone there is calling that house. That should be, again, a 5-alarm warning, because you can see that domestically these people have arrived and they're here. So what happens is these cables come in from foreign stations that are monitoring this meeting that mention the visa in Almeidar's passport. And you could see the back and forth. They're like wondering, hey, what's happening with these guys after they leave the meeting? And at the CIA, there are people who work for the FBI. CIA is only supposed to do international espionage. The FBI is supposed to handle domestic law enforcement. And in order to make them work well together, they send people from one to the other. So guys at CIA will go work with some FBI counterterror. The guys at FBI counterterror will send people to work at CIA. That way, it's supposed to foment teamwork across the board. But it ultimately doesn't work that way in this case, because when the people at FBI, or sorry, the people who work for the FBI who are at Alec Station at CIA see all this information about Al-Qaeda terrorists traveling to the United States after this big terror meeting, when they try to warn their people back at FBI, because to them, they're like, oh, if it comes to the United States, this is our turf. Anything that happens domestically, this is our job to handle. So when they try to warn their guys back at New York counterterror, the people at CIA go, oh, hold on a second. Not yet. Give us a second on this. And they stop this electronic communication from going over, and then they never let it go over after that. But then will later claim that they did share that information. They stop a cable by a guy named Doug Miller from going back to the FBI. And then another FBI person there, Mark Rossini, he starts stirring up a little storm within the office, being like, why can't you let us share this? And they basically tell him, it's not a matter for the FBI. We'll share it when we're good and ready. But then later, when they're under investigation, after 9/11 has succeeded, they're like, oh, we shared that. We thought we shared that. We thought we passed that. And that was really the initial, it wasn't the only moment, but that's sort of the initial big moment where something's happening, where people at the CIA are intentionally not letting domestic law enforcement or even Clarke at the White House and his counterterror team know that these Al-Qaeda bad guys are in country.
And just to add one more thing to that, I mean, again, putting yourself in the shoes of that first year or two or even 5 after 9/11, you've just watched 3,000 of your countrymen die a horrible death as a result of this. So if it were to be proven that these people who worked in the Bin Laden station at CIA knew about this and had some other objective that was unclear at the moment, but that caused them to stop the FBI from doing its job to follow these terrorists in the United States, that would obviously be a thing that could potentially politically damage the CIA. That's putting it nicely. I mean, it could really see the CIA as it existed dismantled, or at minimum, those parties face some serious consequences. So one can understand why the cover-up machine sort of starts as soon as 3,000 die.
So let's pause here, add some additional details, and then continue. I believe there were 3 members of the New York FBI field station stationed at Alec Station, right? Mark Rossini, Doug Miller, who was the one that intercepted the cable, wanted to pass it on to FBI, though just also to throw this in there, that information should have been shared automatically, right? That's something we'll get into also, but he was interrupted from sending that by Tom Wilshire, who was the deputy station chief. And then Mark Rossini, I think, had a series of arguments with Alfredo Bukowski over this
issue. And Michael
issue.
Ann Casey.
And Michael Ann Casey. And then also Maggie Gillespie was also stationed at at CIA from FBI. So these are kind
She
of the
came
main
from the DC office, and
DC
she was an
office.
analyst, and supposedly the CIA welcomed her in a way that they felt, it seems, that they could trust her and control her in a way that they did not feel the FBI agents who had come from New York or who were close with New York, like Doug Miller,
Right.
could.
And now we're actually getting it. Now we have the potential to get into much more detail here, which I don't know if it's necessarily relevant, but there was a whole
Sure.
culture at Alec Station, which it was heavily influenced by by an analyst perspective, because these people were analysts, they weren't field officers. And that's actually highly relevant. And also was a lot of women at the station, which was unusual because of the number of women proportionally that existed at CIA. And there was also, we found out later, some kind of weird, potentially sexual things going on there. And of course, Michael Shorey ended up marrying Bukowski. And there was also a weird kind of like almost like cult aspect to it, where like they seemed to worship Michael Shorey, who was eventually replaced. He was like banished. He went over. He was like stuck at the library at CIA when Richard Blee took over. But so like what? So just to make sure we have timelines here, when was it that this cable came in? Do you guys remember, or did you already say?
January was well, the initial cables were January 2000 that resulted in Tom Wilshire's "Please hold off for now."
Right. Okay, got
on
it.
the
So this was
message.
right after So this is right after the Kuala Lumpur meeting concluded, and they knew
Yeah.
that Al-Mindar and al-hazmi had multiple entry visas, and those visas expired in March. So they had like
Right.
a 3-month window to actually get into the United States. That information was prevented from being sent out, and then after that, how, the big period in time that I have studied, both from your book and elsewhere, was the summer of
Mhm.
2001, because that was, of course, like when uh, George Tenet was saying he was running around with his hair on fire. He had demanded an emergency meeting in, I think, August 6th. I mean, there were multiple important meetings. There was the 10th of July. There was August 6th, and these were principals meetings. And then there was September 4th. But it was the August 6th meeting that he said was the most urgent meeting he'd ever asked for in his 7 years as CIA director. And at no point during this period did they bring up these two hijackers. And by the way, there might have been other hijackers that they knew about, right? Like we
Mhm.
actually don't know if they knew about any of the other hijackers who were in the 4 different counties in Florida, in the DC suburbs, in Maine, in Boston. Like we don't actually know anything about that, but we know as a fact that they knew about these guys. And again, the theory here, as also enunciated most clearly and credibly by Richard Clarke, is that, in case you guys didn't say it explicitly or we need to re-say it again, is that once the CIA figured out that these guys were going to the United States, they had 2 choices. They could either let the FBI know, turn into a criminal investigation, in which case they might lose access to further information and the ability to infiltrate this network. So you can kind of understand the thinking there, all right, because they're not allowed to do domestic operations in the United States, or they could not tell them and then try to flip them. And that's where we get into possibly the Saudi angle and trying to explain really what role were the Saudis playing here. Like, was this the Saudis actually trying to trying to help the hijackers, or were there elements of the Saudi government like Prince Bandar that were trying to help infiltrate this organization going through Bayoumi, but maybe then Bayoumi was actually a double agent working against the CIA. So like, let's go now from these guys entered the U.S. from March or whenever they entered to the summer. Is there any pertinent information? And then let's also begin to flesh out the relationship between the Saudis, the Saudi intelligence, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, the ambassador's office, these bodyguards that were also employed for Prince Bandar, who were also involved as well somehow. I mean, people. That's the thing that's also crazy about this. Like, talk about a hornet's nest. Like, people having all sorts of numbers on their phones connected to this thing. I mean, like, there's so much dirt. It's almost like the connections are so many that it's hard to kind of sort out what is and isn't true.
Can I? Well, so I would almost start with, because you started to give some understanding of what Alec Station was, and I think just a touch of that, because there are these like dynamics of personalities that are sort of important to understand. And so 1993, the World Trade Center is bombed for the first time. Al-Qaeda becomes a known active, terrorist organization that's a threat to the United States over the 90s. So around the mid 90s, CIA decides to go ahead, really, and Richard Clarke pushes for this, but CIA decides under George Tenet, the CIA director, that they're going to create a bin Laden unit. And initially they bring in, it's kind of unusual because it creates controversy because this guy, Mike Scheuer, is an analyst. That's his background. So he hasn't been out doing the spy stuff, recruiting the recruits and trying to get the secret information in the foreign countries with the threats. He's a brain. And so to the hardcore operational spies, it's sort of like, well, why is this guy running a station? And he does develop a cult of personality. I would describe him, if you were to look at him through today's lens, he's a somewhat Trumpian figure. In fact, he vocally supports Trump and violence against the left now on radio and his podcast. But he saw himself as a genius who was unappreciated by the elite and the establishment within the CIA. And when he got fired, he was very upset and felt that was the case, that he'd spoken truth to power regarding Clinton's inactions on bin Laden and these other things, and that's why he was being made to suffer. But he had staffed that entire organization, Alec Station, right, which I think was like 40 or 50 people at that point, and it was mostly women, and it was mostly fellow analysts like him. And whether it was sexism or something else inside CIA, the idea was like, oh, they called him the Manson family or the Scheuer family because they had all drunk the Kool-Aid and were following him. And there were reports that even after he was replaced by the next guy who was an operations spy, Rich Blee, that there were still people on staff who had pictures of Mike Scheuer above their desk, like the cult figure. And yes, when he does marry the number 3 or 4 in the office, Alfreda Bukowski, years down the line, it sort of raises questions about how much he continued to be involved in the events of that office after. So anyway, he hated John O'Neill, and his staff hated John O'Neill.
Tell us who John O'Neill is.
So John O'Neill is in charge of counterterror for the New York office of the FBI, and he's a Boy Scout. I mean, he's not a Boy Scout. He cheats on his wife. He's a big drinker in New York. He's a guy's guy, but he's a by the book guy. The difference that we discovered, and it's not always applicable in every story, but in this story, it seems that the FBI represents the guys who want to follow the Constitution and get these terrorists by the letter of the law, because they're going to be stuck prosecuting them in court later, and they don't want to see these cases get thrown out because they did all kinds of nonsense. CIA is not beholden to such things, and they are more of that stuff is. You stick to, it's like Dirty Harry talk. You do that, you're gonna get everybody killed. Like sometimes you got to break the law to get these things done, and we're semi-sociopaths, which is what John Kiriakou told us was one. The CIA actively strives for people who are willing to do have sociopathic tendencies and are willing to lie to almost everyone except for their bosses. And so that's the dynamic. Is like, so the CIA, this is all sort of important because when it becomes known that these people who attended a major terrorist summit have come to the U.S., the first of the 19 hijackers and allegedly some of the leaders of the hijackers within the U.S., the CIA are not allowed to operate inside the United States. That's why the FBI people were so mystified that this information was not being allowed to be turned over. Because if they're following the law, then well, hold on. If you're not letting us tell the FBI, like the people back at headquarters or New York, and you're not allowed to operate here in the United States, then are we just letting these guys go do their thing? And that's where the Saudi theory comes in, that the CIA, maybe as a way of some kind of legal cover, turns to a foreign intelligence agency, which is also illegal to ask a foreign intelligence agency to spy on your behalf on U.S. soil. But that's the theory as to what happened. So then we get to, I guess, summer, which is what you're asking about, so Richard Clarke, by the way, before I wrap up on this, maybe pass the baton to Duffy, Richard Clarke at the White House, he's seen as very much aligned with John O'Neill, and they're close friends over at FBI. And
he was also close to George Tenet, though. They spoke quite a bit on a regular basis. And wasn't Clarke, just to interject here, wasn't Clarke originally employed by the CIA? Didn't he come up through CIA? Wasn't that where he was originally from?
That's not ringing a bell for me, actually.
Okay, that might be my misunderstanding. So go ahead.
But
him and John O'Neill were very close.
Well, and in the Clinton days, yeah, they were equals. Again, Clinton had had bumped. So he'd hired George Tenet, but he was a bit of a cold fish towards the CIA generally. Didn't trust him. Came from that JFK background where he remembered the quote about, tearing up the CIA and throwing it to the winds or whatever that is. And so that was where Clinton was.
Splintering it to 1,000 pieces.
There you go. And that's where Clinton was initially coming from. So he was a little bit colder to Tenet, and he was obviously warmer to Clarke, who he upped to cabinet level. So then Bush comes in. He only keeps on two people from Clinton's staff, and that's and that is Tenet and Clarke. And there's a bit of a table turn there. Where he's now demoted Clarke, sub cabinet level again, and he seems to be really brought in and glad handed and made, seems the perception from the outside is good old boy George W. Bush really sees something in old, hard fire and Tenet. And that sort of sets the scene of everything up until about that crucial summer of 2001, right before the attacks.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, so I took down some notes here while you guys are talking. Let me just see if there's something relevant to add. So, okay, here we are now in the summer. The meeting on July 10th was again one of the key meetings that occurred, where the CIA was obviously beginning to be concerned. It seems to me, again, so we're not entirely clear on what was the relationship with the Saudis and how they were possibly being used to infiltrate Al-Qaeda. I'd like to understand what you guys think that was, based on everything you read and all the people you've spoken to. But it also seems like at some point, whatever that relationship was, CIA became aware that that it might be going south, or they weren't getting the full story. They might have lost some people. Somewhere their confidence in their ability to control this situation began to come into question, it seems to me. First of all, is that correct? Is that framing correct in your view?
I think that framing is accurate. That a time. So what starting from where Ray left off, basically this idea that the CIA would be illegally trying to infiltrate Al-Qaeda via Saudi proxies in the United States. You have to believe that they were doing that, hoping, yes, to get inside information on whatever Al-Qaeda was up to, and maybe to be able to use that to dismantle the network. And then obviously 9/11 happens. So somewhere in between there's a disconnect. Somewhere it goes from them thinking they can, yes, control this, manipulate it, make it work for them, to, it didn't work, and it blows up horrendously. And the question is, where do they recognize that this is not working and they need to do something about it? And yes, if you look to the summer of 2001, there is a meeting in which Rich Blee, I can't remember everyone who went. I want to say Tenet goes maybe with Cofer Black and Rich Blee. They meet with Condoleezza Rice, and they're claiming this is their biggest warning to the presidential.
That was the August 6th meeting where they also came with the memo, Bin Laden determined to attack the United States.
Before that one on the 10th, I want to say they talked to Condoleezza.
July 10th.
Yeah, and at that time, I mean, you have Rich Blee actually attending, and he is the head of the Bin Laden unit. So this would be an ideal time to mention. And you can't just tell the National Security Advisor, like, hey, we really got to be worried about Al-Qaeda. Go figure that out on your own, lady. You have to give her the best information you have at the time. And they were well aware of the fact that al-Midar, al-Hazmi were in country, and they don't tell her at that time. So what's the point of warning if you're not going to give the details? So what
it's a crucial piece of information. If you're trying to make your best case possible, you would bring that up.
It is the crucial piece of information. And this crucial piece of information will be left out again and again throughout that summer. And you have to ask yourself, why not give that detail? And it does appear that they recognize their plan isn't working, but they cannot admit what they have done. Because if they tell them, Nawaf al-Hazmi, al-Midar, they're in the country, they've been, taking flight lessons, they're calling back to the hub, they probably, know more about what the network's up to at that point than even that. If they say all that, they're going to go, great, we're on it.
They're conducting domestic operations in the United States.
But then the immediate question comes up, how do you know this? How long have you known this? Like, where'd you get this information? And then if they have to explain themselves, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've been committing this crime for a while. So I think their hope is that they can get some other part of the system that they've been intentionally excluding to have enough of a trail to just kind of figure it out on their own and stop anything bad from happening without them having to admit that they've been conducting criminal operations. And this goes all the way up through September 4th. 1 week before the attacks, you have Richard Clarke sitting in a meeting with George Tenet. George Tenet's again bringing up, hey, we got to be worried about Al-Qaeda. We got to be worried about international terrorism. But he doesn't bring up al-hazmi, al-Midar, the visas, the travel to the U.S., Al-Qaeda being present. He doesn't mention at that time. If you watch our interview with Richard Clarke, or if you read the book, Clarke is very adamant. Like, had he told me 1 week before that those guys were in country, we would have found them. We would have rounded this whole thing up. He adamantly believes 9/11 would have been prevented if even that week before he'd been told about all this. They would have gone all hands on deck across the country to get them, and he doesn't even think it would have been hard. But they weren't told, and he just cannot fathom any other explanation than George Tenet is covering up for himself and for his people who've been working illegally in the country. And again, I think they were all just hoping that some other piece of the system would kick in and stop these guys. And that's kind of evident with what they do, passing information to the FBI, because they do finally pass this information to the FBI at the end of August 2001, the day after John O'Neill retires at FBI. They make a phone call and go, hey, these guys are in country. You should look to them. But they start talking to the. It's interesting because there's what that was the wall. There's a split in the FBI between who's can do an intelligence versus a criminal investigation, and they have different powers. They have different abilities to surveil and find people, and they didn't tell the criminal guy.
Right. So I have a question about that because I had read about this also. So they informed some low-level guys at the FBI, correct, about this, just to kind of seed the information somehow. Do we have any idea of who made that call or how that information was passed? And when was this again? Was this in July or was this in August?
It was August of 2001. God, if I had to guess, I want to say 26th, maybe, or between 26th and 31st.
Yeah.
And was it Tom Wilshire that passed this information along?
He's involved. So remember, you mentioned that there was an FBI woman named Maggie Gillespie working at the CIA.
Alec Station, CIA.
And in this very
this is where it gets really weird.
It gets really weird. They do, and I'll try to explain it in the most understandable way. But basically, in the summer of 2001, Wilshire directs Gillespie to go back through all the cable traffic from the Malaysia meeting and see what she can shake loose. And the reason he does this is because he himself rereads cable traffic from the Malaysia meeting. So pause. Tom Wilshire, in the summer of 2001, the deputy head of the bin Laden unit, reads cables that say Al-Qaeda terrorists have gone to the United States. And instead of him just going, oh, this is a big deal and sharing it, he then tasks Maggie Gillespie to, in her free time, re-review this cable traffic.
Then a young, fairly new FBI, analyst who's at an agency that, she's got to report to that isn't her, so she's very fish out of water.
And then, oh, lo and behold, at the end of August, she stumbles onto what? The cable traffic that mentions the visa and the travel to the United States. And then she goes, hey, look what I found. And Wilshire goes, oh my gosh, that's so explosive. You should tell the FBI. Your buddies over at the FBI. And so she does, but it's clearly a cover-up on their own part, because all she's sharing with them is the thing that he had himself found months before. If he thought it was so explosive, when he found it randomly months before, even though he'd seen it also back in 2000, he had so many opportunities to pass that information shared. He could have picked up a phone any day. But this whole thing, they had to make a paper trail or a digital trail that could explain why they were warning the FBI. And so what they did was make it seem like, oh, I was just kind of thinking about that old Al-Qaeda stuff from 2000. So I got this low-level lady to, in her extra time, just to re-review the traffic, see if she could shake anything loose. And oh my gosh, she totally shook loose the bombshell that we should have shared a year and a half ago. Well, let's share it right now. It was a total smoke and mirror show, because they knew they needed to start building the story for the investigation that would likely come. And yeah,
Yeah, after
mean,
the
this
fact,
is
how can you say that that we weren't working on this or trying or that we knew? I mean, why would I put this analyst on this in May to look into this if like
so
if
this
I'd
is the
already
part
reviewed it?
of the
it gives
story
the reason for
where
why she'd make the call.
Yeah.
so this is the part of the story, one of the parts of doing the research that I got physically ill this summer, right? Because and if you really like spend the time and read it, you can't help but get physically ill, especially if you were personally impacted in one way or another by 9/11 or you lived through it, because you really see like, oh, this is like the clock is ticking. We have months now to go before the 9/11 attacks. You guys are sitting on critical information, and your concern is how do you get this information out there so that the crime can be interrupted, this horrific act can be interrupted. And it's also unclear if they really understood exactly at this point what it was without compromising your own personal security, your own well-being, right? So it was
Yeah.
Tom's priority. Again, if you believe all of this, as Richard Clarke has said, Tom's priority was Tom Wilshire. Tenet's
It was
priority was George Tenet.
the
Everybody that was
priority. Yeah,
involved in this what appears to have been a good faith effort to infiltrate Al-Qaeda and keep the United States safe. Like, no one is saying that these guys had bad intentions when they did this. But what is clear is that once they began to see that things weren't that the danger levels were rising, but that they would be somehow implicated, at no point did they say, you know what, I'm going to fall on my sword. I'm gonna do what is my duty. They wanted to protect themselves. Now it's also unclear if they understood how dangerous the situation actually was. Like, in retrospect, one has to wonder, would they have made the same choice if they understood really what the consequences would have been? One would hope not.
Right.
So guys, I'm going to move us to the second hour of this conversation, and we're going to kind of tie this part of the story off and take us all the way to 9/11. I also want to get both of your theories about this concept of a double agent and, how was the CIA interfacing with Saudi intelligence, and did Bayoumi trick these guys? And that might also explain kind of, I mean, this is the fascinating part of the story where there's less clarity, right? Which is exactly what was going on that summer on the from the FBI, from the CIA's perspective, that led them to start to raise the alarm bells, and yet we ended up having 9/11. And then I want to talk about the second half of the story, which is the cover-up. Again, the alleged cover-up, what was done, and how. And this is, I think, the second part where I got physically ill in the story, which is you saw that the people who were responsible got promoted, like Bukowski. She ended up becoming the head of the global jihad unit, and she was actually featured in Zero Dark 30, which when I was reading the story, I was like, I kept thinking to myself, was this person in Zero Dark 30? And then I think you guys actually said it in the book, or I read it somewhere else. Jen Matthews ended up taking over. She was head of Camp Chapman in Afghanistan, and ended up dying because, again, this brings us back to like the fact that these people were analysts, they weren't field officers. So these people got promoted, except I think Tom Wilshire. I think he was like the only person that didn't get promoted in this entire story. And then the people that actually tried to blow the whistle on the stuff, like Mark Rossini or John Kiriakou, either got fired or ended up going to jail or getting fined. And it's a really sad story, but it's one that I think we have to understand because it has critical implications for for understanding how our government works, and also to the extent that we want to reform it. How do we do that constructively? Because as I told you guys, I don't think I mentioned it when we started the show, but there are parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic. There are parallels to the relationship between the National Institute of Health and the Wuhan Institute of Virology and their gain of function research to this story. And there's also parallels to the government's investigations into possible unidentified aerial phenomena, this new name for UFO, and the sort of the classification crisis. I mean, everything is classified, secrecy is everywhere. And so these are kind of the areas where I want to focus our attention. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want to access the second hour of today's conversation with Ray and Duffy, head over to Ray and John, with conversation with Ray and John. Head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Guys, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.